The desert wind howled softly across the dunes, carrying whispers older than time. The Nile shimmered under the fading sun, its surface painted gold, its waters calm and ancient. From high above the river, a city of stone and sand glittered in the evening light, Thebes, the heart of the two lands, where gods were born, and mortals knelt. Inside the royal palace, the air was thick with incense and chanting. Hundreds of priests filled the grand hall, their voices rising like smoke toward the painted ceiling. Each word of prayer echoed against the stone walls, heavy with history. And at the center of it all stood a boy, motionless, terrified, and wearing the weight of eternity on his shoulders. His name was Amenekh. He was 16 years old. And before the sun set, he would become a god. The ceremony had begun at dawn. The priests had bathed him in sacred oils from faraway lands, wrapped him in linen, and painted his eyes with kohl so he might see through the darkness of men. They told him he was not to be seen as flesh or blood anymore, but as divine light, the son of Ra, the sun god himself. From this day, the high priest declared, his voice echoing through the hall, "Your words are law. Your breath is sacred. Your body belongs not to you, but to Egypt." Amenekh stood there, silent, trying to breathe under the heavy weight of the golden collar around his neck. He looked out at the sea of kneeling people, nobles, soldiers, servants, their heads bowed, their bodies trembling in devotion. He should have felt powerful. But he didn't. He felt small. The high priest lifted the golden skent, the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, polished until it gleamed like fire, and placed it on Amenekh's head. The boy's heart raced. The metal was cold against his scalp. "Long live Amenekh, son of Ra," the priest cried. "Lord of the two lands," the crowd thundered. "Living God of Egypt." The roar filled the temple like a storm. Drums pounded. Conch shells blared. Thousands shouted his name. But the boy heard only one thing, his heartbeat, fast and frightened, echoing beneath the golden mask of eternity. That night, the celebration stretched far beyond the palace walls. Torches burned across the city, dancers spun in the streets, and the Nile glowed red from thousands of floating lamps. Wine flowed freely. Musicians played flutes and harps. The people of Thebes rejoiced, their new pharaoh had ascended. But inside the palace, behind walls painted with the faces of gods, Amenekh sat alone in his new chamber. The crown, heavy and dazzling, rested on the table beside him. His hands were trembling. Through the open balcony, the night air drifted in, carrying the scent of lotus and sand. The moonlight painted the room in silver. He rose, walked outside, and looked out over the Nile. The river glided silently, its surface catching the stars like mirrors. He could see the reflection of the temples, the torchlight. The movement of distant boats. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the gods watched, or so he was told. "Ra," he whispered into the night, "do you really see me? Or am I just pretending to be you?" The river gave no answer. Only the sound of the wind, whispering through the reeds. The next morning, his duties began. From dawn to dusk, the palace was a theater of rituals. He was dressed, perfumed, fed, and worshipped. Every morning, priests bowed and chanted, painting sacred symbols on his arms, reminding him, "Your heart is divine. Your thoughts are truth. Your breath brings life." He was taught that the gods lived through him, that his every gesture controlled the fate of the Nile, the harvest, and the people. If he smiled, Egypt would prosper. If he faltered, famine would come. For hours each day, Amenekh sat on a golden throne carved with lions, listening to petitions from nobles and scribes. He learned to nod at the right times, to bless the right men, to speak with the tone of one who never doubted, though doubt was all he knew. He learned that even a god could not say no. At night, when the torches dimmed and the whispers faded, he would walk barefoot across the marble floors of his chamber, tracing the carvings of hieroglyphs with his fingers. The walls told stories of his ancestors, men who conquered nations, who built temples that touched the sky, who claimed to speak to gods. Their faces were calm, fearless, eternal. But the more he looked at them, the more he wondered. Were they ever afraid? Did they ever wish to be free? His tutor, an old scribe named Tebin, once caught him staring at the murals. "Your Majesty," Tebin said softly, bowing, "you look troubled." "Tell me, Tebin," the boy asked, "were the pharaohs truly gods?" The old man hesitated. "That is what the people believe, my lord." "And what do you believe?" Tebin looked into his young ruler's eyes that carried both fire and fear. "I believe," he said carefully, "that even gods are born as children, my pharaoh. And sometimes, they grow into men." Amenekh said nothing, but the words stayed with him forever. Years passed. The boy became a young man. And Egypt prospered. Under his rule, new temples were raised in Thebes and Memphis. Statues of Amenekh were carved in granite, their faces serene and powerful. In one colossal image, his eyes stared east, eternally watching the sunrise, as if defying time itself. But behind the perfection of the stone, the real man was fading. Each day felt like a performance. Each smile rehearsed. Each prayer memorized. And with every passing year, he felt less human. He began to notice things he had never seen before: the trembling hands of servants, the hollow eyes of slaves, the way the priests grew fat while farmers struggled to eat. But when he spoke of change, the high priest reminded him, "It is not for a god to question balance. The gods created order, and you must preserve it." He nodded in silence, though the words burned inside him. One night, unable to sleep, Amenekh wandered into the temple of Anubis, the guardian of the dead. The air was cool, the torches low, the stone jackals watching from their pedestals. In the center lay the sarcophagus of his father, once the ruler of Egypt, now wrapped in linen, silent and still. Amenekh knelt before it. His hand brushed against the carved symbols of eternal life. "Father," he whispered, "did you ever doubt? Did you ever feel alone?" The silence around him deepened. He bowed his head and closed his eyes. For the first time in his reign, the god wept. The next morning, the priests found him asleep beside his father's tomb. They said nothing, only offered incense and led him back to his chamber. But rumors spread quietly through the palace, whispers that the young pharaoh was losing his divine composure. The high priest approached him that evening. "My lord," he said, "the people look to you as the sun. You must not let them see shadow." Amenekh smiled faintly. "And if the sun itself grows weary?" The priest bowed. "Then the world must not know." When he was gone, Amenekh stood before his mirror, a bronze disc reflecting the face of a god that felt nothing like his own. He removed his crown and stared at himself, a man of flesh, of blood, of fear. "Perhaps," he murmured, "the gods made us to feel, so they might remember what it means to live." That night, he dreamt of a different life, of walking through the streets as a simple man, of touching the earth without guards, of hearing laughter that did not come from obedience. When he awoke, the idea would not leave him. And so began the first secret of his reign, a secret that would change Egypt forever. But that was still to come. The sun rose over Thebes, spilling molten light across the horizon. From the palace balcony, Pharaoh Amenekh watched the dawn break like fire over the Nile. That same river that had carried his ancestors into eternity. The city stirred below, fishermen casting their nets, women grinding grain, the faint hum of prayers drifting up from the temples. It was a new day for Egypt, but to Amenekh, every sunrise felt the same. He stood still in his golden robe, his crown gleaming under the first light. Behind him, a servant approached quietly. "Your Majesty," she said, bowing low, "the priests await your blessing in the Hall of Light." He nodded without turning. "As they do every morning." "Yes, my lord." The girl hesitated before leaving, her voice trembling as she whispered, "May the gods bless your heart." Amenekh almost smiled. Almost. When she was gone, he whispered back to the empty sky, "If only they would let me keep it." The Hall of Light was filled with smoke and chanting. Rows of priests stood in perfect formation, their shaved heads glistening with oil, their white linen robes spotless. As Amenekh entered, they fell to their knees. "Praise to the living God," they cried. Praise to the Son of Ra, the eternal light. He raised his hand, a single motion, and silence fell. The ceremony began. Each priest recited verses, each bow a reminder that he was no longer a man, but a symbol, the embodiment of Ma'at, the sacred order that held the world together. The high priest stepped forward, holding a small mirror of polished gold. He raised it toward Amenekh. "Behold," he said solemnly, "the face of eternity." Amenekh looked into the mirror, and saw only a stranger. The crown, the jewels, the eyes lined with kohl, they belonged to a god. But the fear behind them belonged to a man. He wanted to shatter the mirror. Instead, he bowed. Outside the temple, the palace came alive with preparations. The court buzzed with whispers, the pharaoh was to be married. The priests had chosen her carefully, Neferura, daughter of a high priest from Heliopolis. Her bloodline was sacred, her beauty legendary, and her purpose simple, to bear the next god-king. When Amenekh first saw her, she was veiled, her eyes lowered. She spoke little, moved gracefully, and obeyed the silence expected of queens. They were wed beneath the stars, as drums echoed across the river. The people rejoiced, the priests blessed the union, and the scribes recorded every word. But to Amenekh, it felt like another ritual, another golden chain. That night, as the palace feasted, he and Neferura sat alone in the great chamber, a table of gold between them. She broke the silence first. "Do you believe you are a god?" she asked, her voice calm but curious. Amenekh looked at her, surprised. "That is what they tell me." "And what do you tell yourself?" He hesitated. "I tell myself that even gods feel lonely." She met his gaze, and in that moment, something softened. Two strangers, trapped in divine roles, began to see each other as human. Days turned into months. The palace walls echoed with hymns and orders. Amenekh ruled with wisdom, but his heart grew heavier with each passing season. He watched from his balcony as peasants worked the fields, their backs bent under the sun. He saw children carrying stones for temples they would never enter. He saw slaves die quietly in the sand, unburied, unnamed. When he spoke of easing their burdens, the high priest reminded him again. The god does not question the design of the gods. But Amenekh was no longer the boy who bowed to fear. He began to keep records, secret scrolls written in his own hand, of injustices, of the suffering his priests ignored. At night, he would walk through the palace gardens with Neferura. She listened as he spoke of change, of freedom, of a new Egypt where the pharaoh ruled with compassion, not fear. "You dream like a man," she said softly one night. "Perhaps," he smiled sadly, "that is my greatest sin." Then came the drought. The Nile failed to flood. The river shrank, the fields cracked. And hunger spread like smoke. The priests declared it a divine test, punishment for the people's sins. But the people whispered otherwise. "They say the gods have turned away," Tebin, his old tutor, told him. "They say Ra no longer blesses the pharaoh." Amenekh felt the weight of those words press against his soul. For years, he had carried Egypt's faith on his shoulders, and now, that faith began to crumble. He ordered the granaries opened. He sent food to the starving villages. But the priests protested. "It is forbidden," cried the high priest. "The sacred reserves are for the gods alone." Amenekh rose from his throne, his voice calm but cold. "Then the gods shall go hungry tonight." And for the first time in decades, the people of Egypt ate bread that belonged to the temples. The priests were furious. But the people whispered his name in gratitude. That night, Amenekh stood again by the river, the moon pale above him. The drought had left the Nile thin and trembling, its voice weaker, but still alive. Neferura joined him quietly. "You defied the high priest," she said. "I defied a man," he replied. "Not a god." She smiled faintly. "You are changing, my pharaoh." "Perhaps," he said, "I am finally becoming myself." But in the shadowed corners of the temple, the priests whispered too, of rebellion, of blasphemy, of a pharaoh who thought himself wiser than the gods. The high priest watched Amenekh with eyes that burned like coals. He forgets what he is, he murmured to his followers. He must be reminded. And so began a silent war, between the man who wore the crown and the men who claimed to speak for heaven. One evening, while Amenekh prayed in solitude, a young guard entered, trembling. "My lord," he said, "the priests, they spread word that you have angered the gods. That your blood has lost its divinity." Amenekh's voice was quiet. "Do they forget who I am? They remember too well, my pharaoh. That is what frightens them." Amenekh stood, his eyes like the calm before a storm. "Then let them fear the truth." The next day, he summoned the high priest before the entire court. The man arrived in his jeweled robe, his face hidden behind a mask of gold. Amenekh sat upon his throne, silent, steady, and unflinching. "The Nile does not rise," the priest said loudly, his voice echoing across the hall. "Egypt starves, and the gods turn away." "Why?" "Because our pharaoh has turned from the path of the divine." The court gasped. The priest's words hung in the air like poison. Amenekh rose slowly from his throne. His voice was soft, but each word struck like thunder. "I have not turned from the gods," he said. "I have turned from men who pretend to be them." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time, the illusion cracked. A god had spoken like a man, and the world trembled. That night, the high priest vanished from the palace. Some said he fled to the temple at Abydos. Others whispered that his body was found floating in the Nile, his eyes open, his tongue gone. No one dared to ask. Amenekh did not speak of it. But he slept for the first time in months. In the weeks that followed, rain came, gentle, steady, washing the dust from the stones. The Nile began to swell once more. The people rejoiced. And in the whispers of the marketplace, they began to say, "Our pharaoh is not a god made by priests, he is the God who listens." But in Amenekh's heart, he knew the truth. He was no god. He was a man, fighting to remember his own soul inside a palace built for eternity. One night, as he walked through the silent halls, he found Tebin writing by lamplight. The old scribe looked up and smiled. "My pharaoh," he said, "the stories will remember you differently." "How so?" "As the god who dared to be human." Amenekh looked toward the open sky, where the stars shimmered over the river. "Then perhaps," he whispered, "humanity is the only divinity worth having." But the peace he built was fragile, and far beyond the palace walls, forces were already moving. Enemies who saw compassion as weakness. Ambitions that would bleed gold into sand. And a truth buried beneath the temples that even pharaohs feared to uncover. The storm had only begun. The night was still, and the stars shimmered above Thebes like scattered jewels. Pharaoh Amenekh stood in the silent courtyard of his palace, the scent of lotus and incense heavy in the air. The sound of the Nile carried softly through the marble corridors, calm, eternal, whispering to the past. He had restored peace. He had silenced the priests. And yet, the peace inside him felt fragile, like a thin layer of gold covering cracked stone. Since the high priest's mysterious death, the temples had bowed in obedience. The people hailed him not as a god, but as a savior. Bread once again filled the granaries, songs returned to the streets. But in the quiet hours of night, Amenekh could feel it, an unease growing beneath the surface of his golden empire. That evening, as he watched the stars, his queen Neferura approached. "You're awake again," she said softly. "I cannot sleep," Amenekh replied. "Because of them?" He turned toward her, her face bathed in silver moonlight. "Because of what I've done." She touched his arm gently. "You've done what no pharaoh dared, you've given Egypt a heart." He smiled faintly. "And hearts can be broken." Her hand lingered on his. "Then let it break for something true." For weeks, Amenekh's thoughts were restless. He wandered the temples at dawn, spoke to scholars, to farmers, even to slaves, listening, learning, understanding. One evening, an old builder bowed before him. "My lord," he said, "we build tombs for gods. But when a god dies, who buries the man?" The question struck Amenekh deeply. He had built monuments, temples, and halls of gold. But what monument could hold the weight of truth? He returned to his private chamber and began writing, not decrees, but reflections. He wrote of his father's reign, the cruelty of priests, the blindness of kings. He wrote of the people, of their strength, their faith, their quiet dignity. He called it the Book of Breath. It was not meant for priests or scribes. It was meant for the next pharaoh, whoever came after him, a guide not on how to rule as a god, but how to live as a man. The following month, Egypt celebrated the festival of the sun, the day when the pharaoh was said to merge with Ra, renewing the world's light. The priests demanded a grand procession, a display of divine glory. Amenekh agreed, though his heart was heavy. He rode through Thebes in a chariot of gold, the people kneeling, shouting his name. But as he looked down upon them, all he could see were tired faces, eyes filled with need, not worship. He raised his hand, not to bless, but to silence the crowd. "My people," he said, his voice echoing across the square, "I am not your God. I am your servant." The priests froze. The crowd murmured in disbelief. "I bleed as you do," he continued. "I feel hunger, sorrow, joy. The gods are not in my crown or in the gold of the temples. The gods live in you, in every heart that still dares to hope." For a moment, the world stood still. Then, a roar. Some cheered. Others wept. But among the priests, eyes burned with rage. That night, the palace shook with argument. The council of elders, the temple lords, the generals, all demanded he take back his words. "You've insulted the divine order," one priest cried. "You've broken the covenant," shouted another. Amenekh listened, calm and silent. When they finished, he simply said, "Perhaps it was never the gods who made kings, but kings who made gods." The silence that followed was deadly. From that moment, he knew his days were numbered. The whispers began again, quiet at first, then spreading like sandstorms through the corridors. Rumors of heresy. Of curses. Of omens in the stars. And then, the sickness. It began with fever. Then weakness. Within days, Amenekh could barely stand. His body trembled, his voice faltered, yet his mind remained sharp. The palace physicians worked day and night. They burned incense, chanted prayers, offered gold to the gods. But the fever only deepened. Neferura sat by his bedside, her hands clasped around his. "Someone has done this," she whispered. "The priests, they've poisoned you." Amenekh's lips curved in a faint smile. "Then they have freed me." She wept. "Don't say that. I have lived as a god and died as a man. That is enough." Outside the palace, the city trembled. Rumors spread that the pharaoh was dying, that Egypt's sun would soon set. Crowds gathered by the river, lighting candles and clay lamps, praying for his recovery. And yet, inside his chamber, Amenekh lay quietly, no gold, no crown, just linen and oil lamps flickering in the dark. Beside him, Tebin the old scribe entered, tears in his eyes. "My pharaoh," he said softly, "shall I continue the book of breath?" Amenekh turned weakly toward him. "No," he whispered. "It is finished." Tebin knelt. "What shall I write, then?" Amenekh's eyes drifted toward the window, where the dawn light began to rise. "Write that the gods we worship were mirrors. And that the only light worth worshipping is the one that never needed a temple." For 3 days, Egypt waited. On the 4th morning, as the first sunlight touched the Nile, the palace bells rang, slow, heavy, endless. Pharaoh Amenekh, the boy who became the sun, was dead. The news spread like fire through Thebes. Men tore their garments. Women wailed in the streets. The people built shrines of clay and flowers, not gold, for they knew that he had hated the coldness of stone. The priests, too, wore masks of mourning. But behind them, their eyes gleamed. The god-king who had defied them was gone. They ordered the royal tomb sealed in silence. They erased his words from temple walls. They declared him the forgotten pharaoh. But some words cannot be buried. Years passed. The Book of Breath, saved secretly by Tebin, was hidden in a clay jar deep beneath the palace gardens. Generations later, long after Amenekh's name had faded, a farmer unearthed a piece of it while digging near the old palace ruins. The fragment was simple, carved in faint hieroglyphs. A king's crown may touch the sky, but only a kind heart reaches eternity. Centuries turned to dust. The temples crumbled, the statues fell, and Egypt changed, ruled by conquerors, dreamers, and strangers. But deep in the Valley of the Kings, under layers of sand and silence, Amenekh's tomb slept, untouched, undisturbed. Inside, on a small stone near his sarcophagus, one final inscription remained. He ruled not as a god, but as a man. And in that, he found his divinity. When modern archaeologists uncovered the tomb thousands of years later, they were stunned. Unlike other pharaohs, Amenekh's chamber was simple. No mountains of gold. No jeweled masks. Only a few scrolls, a wooden chair, and a bronze mirror. On the mirror's back, etched faintly in hieroglyphs, were his final words. I have seen eternity. And it is made of breath, not stone. The world outside moved on, but Amenekh's truth still whispered, through the sands, through history, through every life that sought meaning beyond power. Because in the end, his story was not about the death of a king. It was about the birth of something greater, the moment when a man looked into the face of divinity and saw his own reflection. And in that reflection, he found peace.